For anyone who's a frequent viewer of the channel, it should come as no surprise that I am a humongous fan of building and collecting model tanks, be it from small scale to large scale, metal, plastic, resin, static, radio controlled, and everything else in between. If it's on the market, chances are I'm going to want to add it to my collection. This has been an activity that I have been pursuing or basically been obsessed with since I was a little kid, and I have been doing it non-stop since that time period. And over the years, I've amassed quite a substantial collection, but it all comes circling back with this video. You see, this video, we're going back to where it all came from. That's right, this is going to be the model that started everything. And exactly what could have been the one particular model that put me on the journey that I've been on all of those years since? Well, it's actually one that started with $5. It really feels good to be back home. Let's go ahead and kick this video off. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/76 scale early production US M4 Sherman tank. The model that we have here is built for my own personal collection, is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is outside of that normal purview, if anyone is interested in the subjects and the scales that I do work in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here has had several modifications and detail upgrades that have been added to it outside of what the standard kit gives you. And in this video, we're going to be going over all of this information. In addition to that, we are also going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this here is the early production version of the legendary, the one, the only, the M4 Sherman tank. Of course, the M4 Sherman tank has its history in the 1930s with the M2 medium tank. That vehicle had basically the footprint of what was to follow, where the suspension, the transmission, and the basic overall layout stayed with U.S. tank development up until the late 1940s with the Pershing. However, when the T6 concept was approved, it entered into production and was designated the medium tank M4. However, the T6 was an all-cast design, and just like with the turret that came out before, they didn't really have the facilities to do single-piece castings of that size in mass. So, as a quick stopgap measure, it was decided to go ahead and basically do the same design but with welded plate. And that became the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman utilizes mostly rolled steel assembly with several cast sections that are smaller in size, which are easier to produce, and then everything is mosaicked together, jigged, and welded to form the shape of the tank. It was this design that entered really into mass production first, which is why this version of the vehicle is known as the M4, and then the M4A1 followed immediately afterward, as by that point they were basically able to figure out the casting issues that were limiting them before. However, both the M4 and the M4A1, specifically the early production versions, both utilized the Continental radial engine, which was an aircraft engine. It was the same engine from the M3. The engine was great. It would come to some problems later on, mostly due to supply shortages, but regardless, it was more than adequate for the job at hand. The M4, of course, its main armament was its key point, where it had a 75mm in a all-cast, fully revolving turret. This was definitely what the Army Ordnance wanted in their tank, and they finally got it with the M4. The very early production versions, or I should say initial production versions, still had lots of M3 Lee components that basically carried over into M4 production. This would be things like the original M3 Lee pattern of VVSS suspension, and also with the design of the transmission cover being a three-piece housing that was all bolted and flanged together. The original M4s, and as well as the M4A1s, had what was known as direct vision, where the driver and the radio operator both had a flip-up visor, which allowed both of these crew members to be able to see directly out through the front of the vehicle, which made driving and operating the vehicle a bit easier. Unfortunately, that feature was proven to be a bit of a design flaw because it was actually a weakness in the armor, as it turned out when the vehicles actually entered combat, and this was something that was quickly addressed with the use of both adding extra layers of armor plate over these sections, welding them solid, and then later on in the production run, just eliminating them outright. Regardless, these vehicles were extremely successful, and a large number of them were produced. They were used by both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marines, and even these vehicles were heavily exported out to allied countries, namely the United Kingdom as well as their Commonwealth, who used them to great effect throughout the duration of the war. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea of what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage 1/76 scale Airfix M4 Sherman tank kit. This is a build that I've been eagerly wanting to do a proper model showcase video on for a number of years. Of all of the models that I've done model showcase videos on in the past and will do model showcase videos on in the future, this one here holds a particular special place in my heart for some very personal reasons that I'll touch upon momentarily. However, for one reason or another, I kept on procrastinating on either picking this kit up, as well as even doing the model showcase video on, as I had to clear my schedule, getting ready for this particular project here. But here we are right now. So this model, of course, is from the company Airfix, and Airfix is a legendary model company. They've been around forever and are one of the oldest plastic model companies still in existence producing models. Airfix, this should not come as a surprise to many of my European viewers out there, are a British-based plastic model company and have been producing models in polystyrene since probably the 1950s or so. In fact, Airfix are one of the original OGs in the plastic modeling market. Some other kits that were around at the same time would have been Aurora, Hawk, as well as even Renwall. So this kit here fits into that age demographic. As I mentioned in another vintage Airfix video, being the T34, 76, and 85 model, of course it gives you the option for both, in the 1960s time frame, Airfix decided to enter into the armor modeling market. And they released quite a wide range of vehicles in 1/76 scale. One of them, of course, being the one that we have here, the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman kit was originally tooled up by Airfix in, I want to say, 1960, and basically this kit has been in production basically ever since. The outer form has changed quite a bit depending on the releases, be it the box art, the packaging type, as well as even just they include this kit in several bundle packages, but the tooling itself is the original tooling from 1960. These models here are ridiculously easy to come by and can be found for some very affordable prices, and this is true for most of the other kits in the Airfix vintage lineup. And it's because of both the ease of availability as well as low cost is what kept these vehicles still in relevance all the way up to today. And again, these models just don't want to go away. They're basically the horseshoe crab of the armor modeling world. They are ancient and they are definitely sticking around with us for quite some time. And that's more or less a very good thing, because these kits are really cool. And as I stated earlier in the pre-video intro, this kit here has a very special place to me personally, because one of these Airfix Shermans was literally the very first plastic model that I ever built. And it's because of building this model over here, I absolutely fell in love with the hobby of plastic tank building. And if I didn't build this model, it's very likely that I would have never entered into this hobby, and the ECA channel, or just ECA in general, would not exist. I'm pretty sure there's some butthurt YouTubers out there that wish that happened, but sadly that's not the timeline we're living in. That model is still in existence today and may or may not make an appearance later on in this video. That model I built at the ripe young age of 6 or 7 years old, and was actually not the size or format that we have here. Like I mentioned before, this kit has been re-released by Airfix in a multitude of different configurations, from the standalone kit to ones that are a package deal where it is paired up with another vehicle. In the case of the one that I had, or still have, that one was paired up with a landing craft, and when my father bought the set, he kept the landing craft for himself and gave me the Sherman. The model was built by me and my father, and he basically taught me how to do the basics of cutting things off sprues, gluing them together, and at the end of the day, I had a fully built and painted M4 Sherman tank model. And I did what every kid would do when you hand them a model like that at that age, and I played with it. Yes, I played with this thing to absolutely no end, and miraculously, it held up very, very, very well. The model itself is fairly robust, considering what it is and how many parts that it has, and like I stated before, it's still in existence today. Now, granted, I haven't played with it in 20-something years, but that does not change the fact that that thing was played with to absolutely no end. So fast forward about 30-something years, I'm in none other than Hobby Lobby. Again, just killing some time. I go into the plastic model aisle, which I really shouldn't do, but regardless, I was there, and lo and behold, they had a restock of their Airfix kits. One of them was the T-34, obviously I already did that video, and here goes the next one that I saw, and I'm like, yeah, screw it, let me grab it. The M4 Sherman tank. The models retail for about $7.99. However, Hobby Lobby being Hobby Lobby, they had a 40% off on plastic model kit sale. So once everything was said and done, I got the thing for a little over $5. Which, considering the age that we're in right now, that's almost the price that these things were, you know, for the longest time in the way back when, let's just say, prices weren't as nuts. So, starting with the model's graphic design, here you can see the box art. This, by the way, is part of Airfix's Vintage Classic re-releases. Airfix has been a company that goes in and out of solvency as time goes on, and recently they were acquired by another manufacturer who brought back the brand, and one of the things they did, wisely I might add, was to re-release many of their old vintage kits. The Sherman here, of course, being one of them. They went with their mid-1960s box art that we have here. The earlier versions of the Airfix Sherman had a different box art, and the model was actually bagged, where you had just a cardboard top section with the box art, and you can actually see the parts that are in a little bag that was descending downward. As time went on, they revised that type of packaging to a standard box like we have here, and they've basically kept it in this format ever since. So getting back to the box art and the graphic design, here we have the vehicle right here, front and center. The box art is extremely action-packed. This is definitely not a tranquil scene in any which way. We got MGs going, main armament going, rounds coming in, deflecting off. We got other tanks in the background doing what they need to do. The city's on fire, getting bombed. It is definitely a scene that is just dripping with action. The quality of the illustration is decent. The tank does have some proportion, things that are out of whack, like the tracks are a bit too wide, but you know what? Screw it, this box art rocks. So I'm not going to be able to comment any further on that. This is a very iconic box art, and it's definitely one of the more famous ones that have been released on plastic model kits in the last, again, 60+ years. As for the remainder of the graphic design, well, we have the typical Airfix fonts right here with the black stroke. The Airfix logo, for the recent incarnation of Airfix, they went back to their vintage logo like we have here, which is pretty cool. And of course we have here the Vintage Classics little badge. Just like with the T-34, it's the same type of layout where it's a side opening tab box. On this side over here, we have some verbiage, and we have two options that this vehicle be built in US as well as also British Army, which makes sense for this pattern of Sherman. Skill level 2, right there, I should be able to tackle that. We have some point system now, which is pretty neat. On the opposite side here, we just have some corporate information. As I mentioned before, Airfix is owned by another company. That company is Hornby at the moment. This is always subject to change, but for this pattern here, it's Hornby. This kit, I believe, was released, by the way, in 2019, so it's a relatively recent re-release. But like I stated before, these kits were made in such high volumes that tracking one down was very easily done. On the back portion here, just like with the T-34, we have a nice little color chart of the markings. I like that they went with the really early war markings here, which is generally something that you would see in North Africa, but also you would see this in the U.S. Armor School. It's very similar to my M4A4 Sherman that I did in 1/6 scale, but of course that's a topic for another video. And it's going to be overall a really fun build, like I mentioned before. One other thing I want to mention is that the decals found on these new re-releases are done by Cartograph, and Cartograph is actually a very good decal company. I've had a few kits that have had their decals supplied in the past, and they are always excellent quality. So we'll see how that pans out once this model enters into paint and gets its final coat of varnish. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dump out the contents. Just like with the T-34, everything is sealed right here in this hermetically sealed bag. And this obviously is a 100% old school plastic model kit. No resin, no photo etch, no 3D print, nothing. It's just polystyrene and vinyl for the tracks, which is always an excellent, excellent track manufacturing method. Also supplied are the instructions, of course, and just like with the T34, I'll get to that in a minute, the instructions look to be very, very, shall we say, economically printed. It looks like something that you basically downloaded a PDF off the internet and printed with your own laser printer, and there's really nothing wrong with that per se. Jumping ahead with the instructions. Okay, we have a nice little color chart right here, like I mentioned before. Same one found on the back. And boom, old school illustrations at their finest. These are not CAD drawings, these are old school, basically, you know, hand drafted drawings, which is what you generally see on many of these older vintage model kits. Everything you need to assemble one Sherman tank is right here, no more and absolutely no less. So now that you saw the instructions, I might as well go over the decals. Like I said before, these are printed by Cartograph, so we have modern printing decals. It's a blue paper backing type water slide. And as I mentioned before, generally these decals are very good quality. And looking at them in the light, I'm not seeing any crinkles or rips or anything like that. Nothing indicating that these decals should give me any sort of problems. But, you know, we'll see when the decal hits the water exactly how that pans out. To open up the bag, I need a scissor here because the hermetic seal is pretty good. So, there we go. Everything is molded in this lime green colored plastic. This is something that would change on several of the other re-releases of this kit. The Sherman, I remember the plastic was slightly different in its hue, but for the modern incarnation of these Airfix kits, this seems to be the color that they're rolling with. This is the same plastic used on the T34. And oh, and by the way, unlike the T34 where you had an option of different type of turrets, for the Sherman over here, it's much more cut and dry. What you see is basically what you get. So, starting with this runner that we have here, takes us to the suspension. Here you get to see the VVSS suspension system, which of course is basically a very important bit of detailing found on the Sherman. The suspension has the overall look and shape of the VVSS. Now, granted, compared to some more modern kits like the Walters Force of Valor M4A1 Sherman that I did a little while ago, this is going to be much more simplistic compared to that kit, and that kit, by the way, is a simplistic model in its own right, but this one here is a little bit more simplistic compared to that one. Obviously, next to something like a Dragon Sherman, this one is definitely going to be basically rudimentary in comparison. Having said that, of course, you still get everything that you need to get the look and feel of the VVSS. We have the little rib sections here found on the housing casting. We have the swing arms. We have the sections for the mud slits. Basically, everything is there that would be present on the real Sherman tank. We also have here the bow 1919. We have the early pattern of mantlet. It has all the fasteners present, which is a nice bit of detailing. Specifically, considering the age of the tooling, I mean, like I stated before, this thing dates back to 1960, so, you know, they're able to get this type of detailing in on a model this tiny. It's actually pretty remarkable with the technology they had of the era. You can see the bow hatches right there. They do have their periscope details present, as well as also that distinctive bulge found on the early pattern hatch. And we also have the split hatch cupola hatches right over there. They are molded separately, so you do have the option to have the cupola molded in the open or closed state. Next runner takes us to some more suspension components. Here we have the back sections of the VVSS. These are much more rudimentary compared to the swing arm details found on the front portion, but again, these being on the back and with the scale, more than suffice for the job at hand. We also have here the top sections of the VVSS. You can see the return roller detailing integrally molded into its mount, which is simplified, and it definitely cuts down on parts number found on this model here. And it'll be cool to see what it looks like once everything is painted, weathered, and with the tracks installed. Next runner, still on the suspension, takes us to the running gear. You get to see the idlers. The idlers are attempting to mold the open spoke versions found on early production Sherman tanks, which for this vehicle here is more than adequate. The row wheels are the later stamped versions of the Sherman row wheels, which again, totally fine. These Sherman row wheels, you know, that's part of the fun of building Shermans. You can have them a gazillion different ways and all of them will work. There is some small flash found on some of the tooling here. Again, quite customarily seen on kits of this vintage. Definitely far from being a deal breaker or anything. It polishes up very, very easily. And we also have the sprockets. Sprockets look to be okay. They do have their teeth that are individually molded, which, again, for the age of this kit is actually pretty good. It wasn't uncommon for kits of this era to just have a round disc, and then you have like a drawing of a sprocket in place. Something from Renwald or Revell definitely comes to mind. So having a sprocket with actual individual teeth molded in was a big plus, you know, during this time period. The sprockets are mostly clean. There is a little bit of flash found on this one over here. Again, definitely something that isn't a problem. I can clean that up in practically no time. The sprocket is a multi-part assembly, which gives it for nice little detailing. And there's just basically one more sprue of running gear, and that's what we have here. And this is just the remainder of the roll wheels. Roll wheels are the exact same detailing found on the one on the opposite sprue. Also on the sprue here, we have the early pattern split hatch Commander's cupola. You can see the pintle mount right there, integrally molded on. We have these two lugs over here. If I'm not mistaken, I believe these are the center portions for the sprockets. And once everything is assembled, you then have this sprocket complete. You can plug it into the vehicle. We have here the coax M1919, as well as the main 75 with its thin little mantlet integrally molded in. Obviously, the barrel is definitely not drilled out. This is something that needs to be addressed by the builder, and the little fasteners that are found on the mantlet over there are definitely going to be absent on this older school tooling kit. The next runner takes us to some hull sections, and here we have the bottom plate. It is riveted, oddly enough. Some Shermans did have that, but, you know, it's just some basic detailing nonetheless. We have here the side plate. The idler mount is integrally molded in right over there. It appears that they had some breakage over here because on the real Sherman there are these spokes that are found on the real castings, and it appears that there's a little bit of material loss in that section over there. Probably when they were cleaning up the mold, some section cracked off and they just basically left it. And because they have like this little rock pebbly type effect over there. It's definitely not a problem for this model build at all. It's not really visible, but it is something I did want to mention. And it's definitely something that caught my eye. We have here a number that's molded on the outside, interestingly enough. Usually that's found on the inside where no one can see it, but it's right there on the outside. We do have some knockout marks. Again, this is a product of its era. We do have the final drive detailing right there, which is a nice little bit of detailing and something that, you know, that wouldn't necessarily have been commonly seen on vehicles of this scale and from this era. So that's a nice little detail touch. The rear plate over here has the two large engine doors. We do have some more idler mount details, a bit simplified, but, you know, again, 1/76 scale should work just fine. On the real Sherman over here, this midsection would actually be mesh work, but it's not on the Airfix model. And also, we do not have any sort of the air filtration boxes or the exhaust manifolds, which would be present on the real vehicle. The very final runner takes to the remainder of the hull details, which we have another side plate. Basically, it is a mirror image from the one found on the opposite side, including the little clunk over there found on the idler mount. We also have here the turret. This being an early pattern Sherman, it's the early single hatch turret, and what you see is what you get. Looks pretty good for what it is. It definitely has the overall shape and appearance of the early pattern Sherman turret, which, by the way, I always did like these early turrets. They look kind of cool. We have here the gunner scope, the secondary optic, the antenna base, the secondary antenna base mount, and also some footman loops found on the rear bustle. The antenna base is integrally molded in, and it looks to be the British pattern of antenna base mount. Not surprising, as this kit is offered in British markings, and that would be appropriate for that type of vehicle. We have lift rings integrally molded into the sides for what appear to be a lift ring, or is that just extra flash? No, it's just extra flash. On this side here, we have a shell ejection port, again, very plain and basic. I'll go into more information about that as the video goes on. And here we have the upper hull. Note on this model here, the turret is not replaceable, just like, or I should say, unlike the T-34, where you can swap out the turrets. For this one here, once the turret gets fitted in place, That's it. You ain't taking it off. So other than that, you can see the upper hull details. It is definitely an early pattern of Sherman. So early, in fact, it looks like that they tried to model the version with the direct vision ports right there and there, which is pretty cool. We have here the rear engine deck details. Note, everything is integrally molded on, from the air duct cover to, or I should say the radiator blower cover, to the tools. The Pioneer tools generally are separate moldings. On this model here, they are, nope, integrally molded on for your convenience. The remainder details seem to be pretty good. I mean, they have their tow cable clip right over there and there. We have the meshwork obviously is going to be missing. You're not going to find that on this type of tooling. On the front over here, we have some brush guards integrally molded on. The headlights are molded on as well, and we also have the bow M1919 right there. The bow antenna base mount is present. Nice little bit of detailing. And then this brings us to probably the biggest quirk I always had with the Airfix Sherman, and that is with the front transmission cover. Jumping ahead a little bit, this is something that is an amalgamation of the three-piece transmission cover as well as the later single-piece transmission cover. It has the geometric shape of the later version. However, they molded in the flange detailing, which would have been present on the earlier pattern. So this is something that is not going to be kept, and I'm going to promptly polish that away as the build progresses. But it is one bit of detailing that is just iconic, found on this older kit, and it's one that always stood out to me even all these years later. The very last thing to mention are the tracks. The tracks are single-piece vinyl. They do have some excellent detailing on them for the scale, as well as also with the vintage. Once the camera focuses in, you can see we have the rubber block detailing in place, as well as also the track and connector detailing. The horns are molded into the appropriate location, which is pretty cool. This is something that Tamiya wouldn't even do until many years later. And the Airfix kit, you know, has it dead to rights right over here. The track is made out of this very flexible material, the same exact material that's found on the T34 kit. And that's actually a very good thing, because one thing I do remember, one quirk that this kit had from the first go-ahead that I had with it, was that the tracks are ridiculously tight. And this was also something I ran into on the Walters Forces of Valor 1/72 scale Sherman. The tracks were very, very tight, and I'm going to be going into this build knowing that, and it's going to reflect on how the build actually progresses with the installation of the suspension, and I'll touch upon that, of course, as the video goes on. But regardless, the tracks are way more flexible than the ones I remember on the older tooling kit. And here's the model with the hull fully assembled. It's also at this point here where I made a bunch of hull mods in order to... So let's go ahead and go over some of the modifications that were made to the model in order to bump up the accuracy from the kit original. So the first thing I do want to mention is with the transmission cover. The transmission cover on the Airfix was definitely one that was a miss. It has the shape of the later pattern all-cast transmission cover, but it has the detailing of the three-piece flange-type transmission cover that we see on the early M4, and also, you know, basically it's carryover from the M3 Elite. Well, for this one over here, after the hull sections were glued together, the flange sections were deleted. These were just amputated away with a Dremel, as well as some needle file and some sandpaper, and then once polished away, the entire front section here was covered over in a nice coating of the cast texturing. The cast texturing does twofold. First, it blends in the surface area, or I should say, first it gives you the texture of the cast, which is great. The second thing is it deletes the seam, which is found on this section over here where the two hull sections combine, or I should say connect, and also it flares in and thoroughly deletes any remnants of the three-piece flange detailing that was originally present. On a similar note, another hull mod was done right back here on the rear plate. On the Airfix Sherman, it's just basically a 90-degree angle on this section over here. However, on real Sherman tanks, there is a angle plate that we have right over here on this section. Fortunately, this was easy to sculpt in because of the thicknesses of the plastic in this area over here. This was simply just carved into the model with the use of a flat needle file. I carefully just went over these areas over here until finally the necessary material was removed, giving you for the appropriate appearance that you see here. Also on this section here, you can see the seam work was also done on the sponson area. Just some thin super glue was added in these sections, and I just polished it in, making for a nice smooth appearance. And that leads us to the upper extremities. So One thing about these early pattern Shermans, and this is something I always mention in these Sherman videos, is that they were a mosaic of components. It was about half a dozen parts that all jigged together, and then they could go ahead and weld it up. And the parts consisted of both rolled plate steel and cast steel, depending on the component in question. And because of that, you will have this segmented Frankenstein type jigsaw puzzle appearance that you see on the model, and these details are absent on the stock Airfix example, so I went ahead and decided to add them at this time. So you can see here how the front plate is made up. We have here 2 side panels, then there's this one giant section right here on the front, then this section here is actually a mix of 3 components. So we have one casting for the hull hatch for the driver, a mirror image casting for the radio operator, and then there's this middle section casting right over here that gets sandwiched in between. It's also important to point out that depending on which manufacturer made these vehicles and what period they made these vehicles, also the type of Sherman that these vehicles are, this setup here can change. So the angle on some of the welds are a little bit different on some of them. On this one, you notice they come straight down and then they bend outward. I believe this one is from Alco, if I'm not mistaken, or Pullman, one or the other. There is a fantastic reference for this information, by the way, and I have it in the video description listed below, and it'll greatly help you with your builds, specifically, ones for Shermans. In addition of the welds being added to these sections over here, I might as well go ahead and just weld up the rest of the vehicle, and I added them to all the appropriate locations that the welds would generally be found on. This also includes the ones on the front and rear, as well as also on the segmented sections of the plate. At this time here, you will also see that I went ahead and deleted many of the molded in details that were present on this section over here, such as the grab handles. Those were pitched, and I am also going to be fabricating the other sections of details, like the headlights and things like that. So, it's best to just, cauterize everything just so we have a nice surface ready for the new detailing. Same is also true for the ones on the rear. You can see that the molded in taillights have also been amputated as well. On the front section, on the 2 driver areas, there was a small sinkhole found in these areas, a very slight one, but just one that was easily taken care of, just a little smear of red putty, and then it was just polished away to the look that you see here. The Airfix Sherman does replicate a very, very early rendition of the Sherman like I touched upon before, and this is one with DV or direct vision, and that's what these 2 little bits of detailing here are on the front. I'm going to render this one in this format, and because that, you will have a certain shape found on the driver's hoods, and they are very different compared to the later versions of the M4 where they pitched the direct vision port and they thickened up the armor here on the front. And that one does have a backup periscope located in front of the hatch section. But for this one here, that's not going to be necessary because, again, this is such an early example of an M4. So now that you know what I've done to the model itself, now let me go ahead and mention what I'm going to be adding to this model in order to kick it up from the stock kit original offering. Me not being able to leave well enough alone and chasing after something like a dog chasing after a mail truck, I went ahead and saw some areas where it did leave some room for improvement on this model, and I went ahead and tooled up several components in order to go ahead and correct these, as well as bump up the model's overall look and accuracy. Here you can see the parts right here. These components here are HD 3D printed and are a new addition to the ECA small scale product line. These components here are found on the ECA Shapeways store, along with the other components that I offer for 1/35th scale models and smaller. The ECA webpage itself is dedicated to just 1/6 and 1/16, so for the smaller scale stuff, that's all listed on the ECA Shapeways store, and the link to that can again be found in the video description, as well as the direct link to these exact same items can be found there as well. One other thing to mention is that currently you see on the table that there are 2 separate sets. However, since I designed this set, I decided, let me go ahead and make something else, and then I went ahead and tooled up these parts over here. But the ones that you will see on the actual catalog listed for for sale are going to have these fused into the set, so one set will contain all the components that you see here. Also, you have enough components to outfit 2 Airfix Sherman tanks with a few other components as spare in case the need be ever arises. As for what they are, well, let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer so you get a better look. So starting with the big runner, here you get to see the major bulk of the parts. So some of the deficiencies, or I should say some of the shortcomings found on the Airfix model, are that they omitted several details that should be found on basically all of the Shermans. Some of these fittings would include the front tin work, which you can see right here. The tin work is fully detailed with that embossed rigidity stamp. We also have the fasteners integrally printed on, and in addition to that, we have the side support right there integrally printed on. Since it is a single piece, you just simply remove it off of the sprue and affix it to the front portion of the model here and here. We'll see what that looks like as the build progresses. In addition to that, you will also see the headlights and the taillights. These are my 1/6 scale US AFV headlights and taillights, and I simply just took these units and shrunk them all the way down to 1/76 scale, and these are the ones that you see here on the sprue. I give you more than enough for 2 vehicles because these are the type of parts that can break on you, and, you know, if you play your cards right, you could probably outfit an extra vehicle or so. But regardless, you do have quite a few at your disposal. The other bits are also the tin work. We could see the rear dimpy mud flaps, or I should say dimpy fenders, right over here. These are the very early pattern of rear fenders, and these type of pattern would be found on vehicles from the very early production batch. And with this Sherman being this type of vintage, these pieces here would not be uncommonly seen. They would be very quickly pitched in field because of the propensity of getting broken and dinged up all the time, and I can attest to that having these in metal on my M4A4. They have been a pain in the ass ever since, but, you know, it is appropriate for that vehicle. That's why I did them in the first place. Regardless, on the 1/76 scale one here, I went ahead and took my actual template for the sheet metal ones and built it in CAD and shrunk it all the way down to, you guessed it, 1/76 scale, and you can see these pieces right over here. The final bits of components are for the rear area here of the vehicle. This is the way the kit is, and if you build one of these Airfix Shermans, back here it's completely empty. There's no other details that are found on the rear section besides the ones that you see here, namely the rear engine hatch. On the rear portion of these early M4 Shermans, you will know that there's a ton of stuff going on back here. Most 2 important things are the oil bath air filters as well as the exhaust manifolds. And both, of course, are missing on the Airfix kit, so I went ahead and tooled up the units right here. Here you can see the oil bath air filters. For this one here, I went with the cylindrical pattern. There were 2 patterns used on these vehicles during the war. One was a box type setup, and this is generally the type that you see on most of the 1/35 scale Shermans on the market. And then there was also a cylindrical pattern, and this one here is very similar to the oil air bath system that you'll find on heavy equipment, most notably like a Cat bulldozer, excavators, or not excavators, but graders. They generally have the same exact components and they work the exact same manner. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised they're manufactured by the same subcontractor that made them for all those other companies. Regardless, the 1/76 scale one here is fully detailed with the mounting straps, the mounting base, the bottom removable pan, and we even have the wing nut and eyelet details all integrally printed on. It's quite amazing what you could do these days with this technology. In addition to the air filters, here we have the exhaust manifolds. These here have the socket details, the goosenecking details, as well as the open sections right over here with that distinctive triangular shape. There is a inner brace that we have, and again, that detailing is found on the real example, and it's present on the 1/76 counterpart as well. The entire unit is a single printing, so you just snip it off, and you just glue it to the rear section of the model, right under there, and presto, you now have your inner detailing. One last thing I do want to mention is that you'll notice that there are two different types of materials. That's because my printer no longer really produces things in this material anymore, and they have since switched over to this yellow resin. The resin properties are basically the same, but they're no longer translucent like they are on this older pattern set. So the new ones will have this section integrally printed on, like I mentioned before, and it will also be one color, being that yellow color. Jumping ahead a little bit takes us to the model at this point here where it's assembled, and at this point it's actually ready for painting. At this point, all of the 3D printed components that I mentioned before have been fitted in place, and I also added the last of the scratch build components in order to flesh it out to the way we have it here. So going over the details at this point brings us to the tin work. So the tin work, again, are the HE 3D printed parts that I mentioned before, and here you can see them fitted in place. They are mostly drop-in, but there is a little bit of hand fitting that needs to be done to the tank in order to get these to fit on perfectly, and that involves removing just a tiny bit of material off of the bolt strip found there on the top leading edge of the transmission cover. It's like a millimeter, if that. You just basically carve that away with an X-Acto or a needle file, and then once that little bit of material is removed, the fender will drop directly into place and will index absolutely perfectly. Also on the front here, you can see the bow headlights that have been added. I simply just drill two small little holes into the armor plate, and then the piece just drops directly in. I'll circle back on the metalwork in a moment, but let's continue with the 3D printed parts. So on the back section here, you can see the air cleaners fitted in place. And you can also see the exhaust manifold fitted as well. These three here, again, basically just a drop-in install. On the exhaust, I had to do a little bit of hand fitting of the part to get it to fit in place, but I'm going to make these modifications to the actual production units so that they will be much easier to be installed compared to the first front set that I have here. Regardless, once fit in place, you can see just how much they improve the stock model. Also, at this point here, you get to see the rear tin work, again, fitted in place to the appropriate locations, and you can just see how much they fleshed the model out. Directly on top of that takes us to the taillights, and as one would imagine, they too give the model some extra detailing. So that's really it for the 3D printed parts, and this brings us to the other parts that were added in order to work with the printed parts. So while we're on the back, we can start with the two guards that we have here on either side. When the Shermans, or actually this detail traces back to the M3 Lee, had the air filters put in place, these were actually a secondary modification that came a little bit later on. And when they were fitted in place, the areas were actually still open to the rear idler wheels. And this was deemed to be a problem because of any sort of particulate that can be kicked up by the tracks can easily damage the sheet metal air filters. So to protect them, slabs, or I should say plates of steel, were added to these sections over here, and they act like little wings or guards, and they protect and really shield the air filters from any sort of problems from the tracks getting kicked up. All Shermans with the radial engine with this type of system had these components fitted in place. Perhaps some very early renditions of the Sherman did not, and I go over that in the early M4A1 monogram video in a little bit more depth, but generally as a rule of thumb, when these components were fitted in place, the shields were added. The shields themselves were fabricated out of strips of styrene strip. Basically drew the component out with a pencil, cut, carved, and then fitted them in place. Very easy installation indeed. From there takes us to the metalwork, and that was probably the most challenging aspect of the entire model, not because of scratch building the parts themselves, Lord knows I've done that more times than I can count, but due to the smaller scale on this one here, it definitely added to complexity. So starting with the easy stuff brings us to the lift rings, and these were just made out of thin pieces of floor wire that were drilled into the surface, and then the parts were just added. These would include the two on the sides of the front hull, two on the rear, and the three on the turret. One on the top here, and the other two were on the rear bustle. And note, on this one here, I went with a very early rendition of the Sherman turret casting, where it had the lift rings mounted up high. As production continued and as the war went on, the location was moved to the bottom portion of the bustle. But for this one here, because it's such an early rendition of an M4, I went with that earlier rendition. The grab handles, again, really easily made. I just took some floor wire, bent it around a piece of 16 of an inch metal rod, and that gave me the perfect bends that you see here. Pieces were snipped and then just simply installed and glued in place. Where the challenging aspect came in was with the brush guards. So the brush guards on a Sherman tank, of course, are iconic, and you can't have lights without the brush guards. And the brush guards were fabricated out of the same wire that I used for the lift rings, but I had to flatten them in order to replicate the steel strip material that the real ones are made of. So I flattened the wire out with a hammer, and then I was able to bend everything to shape and glue it on. The ones in the back aren't too bad. They're just a two-piece assembly. You have a rounded section that covers the face, and then a strip that is bent to shape and then glued on where it needs to be. The real trick, or I should say the hardest part about installing all of these type of brush guards was, outside of bending them, was trying to physically glue the part in place. What would always happen is I have the part clamped into my tweezer or my small plier, but for one reason or another, it would stick to the tool instead of the item because the piece is magnetic or got magnetized somehow, and that was a bit of a pain. Fortunately, I had some scrap plastic rods around or strips, and I was able to basically use that as a pick and probe and to nudge the part into place. It was a little time consuming, but I was still able to pull it off. But it's one of those things that once it's done, I'm glad I'm not doing it again, or at least not for a while. Ones in the back weren't too bad. The ones in the front were definitely the final boss. Oddly enough, I did them first. So the ones in the front are very ornate on a Sherman because not only are they flat strip, but they bend in basically two directions. We have the simple bend, which is the loop that goes around the headlight, and then we have the compound bend, which has to curve around with the headlight. And in 1/6 scale, this is something that's done by taking a piece of strip, or I used to before the print ones came out. I would add a bunch of little cuts into the side, and then that would allow me to bend everything in place and solder it and solidify it. I've even done that in 1/16. Obviously in 172, that's just, or 176 in this case, that's not going to be possible. So but unfortunately with the way the wire is soft, with the nature of it, and with the small size, I was able to still get those bends in place by flattening the wire and just carefully bending it with the plier. It was a little tricky to do, but it was still able to be done regardless, and it came out actually better than I could have anticipated. The hardest part was gluing the two little arms on either end. First, they had to be cut to shape. They had to be cut to shape on the exact same length, which is, sounds easy, but it's actually a little bit harder than it sounds. And after that, I had to glue them in place, and that's where, again, the magnetized plier was not doing me any favors. Regardless, I was still able to pull it off. And after just finishing that last clip, I realized there was one bit of detailing that I negated to add, and it's one that if I didn't add one, I would hang my head in shame, and I would definitely not be able to call myself a Sherman fan. And that is on the brush guards. I needed to add that little canister, which is an iconic bit of detailing found on this pattern of vehicle that's found on either end. As I always mention in these videos, the M4 Sherman had a little canister welded to the side of the brush guard, and this was used to have a little chain retained plunger that would close off the opening of the headlight when not in use. That little bottle, or I should say it's like a little tube section, would be present on the real unit. It would be found on this vehicle here, ergo it needs to be added on mine. The piece is actually made from a scrap sprue of 3D print from another project that I'm currently finishing off at this time, and that's something that's going to be the topic for another model showcase video. But regardless, it's good to keep, or you have to keep an open mind, because sometimes the piece that you need is lying right in front of you. With the addition of these two little parts over here, it definitely enhances the model even further compared to the way I even had it before. So at this point now I can safely say that the tank is ready for painting. Starting with the model suspension, all the running gear you see here is the kit original and was basically utilized out of box. The suspension went together very easily, and the tracks, I was happy to say on this one here, were a very easy installation. As I mentioned before on previous examples of these tanks, the tracks tend to be a bit stiffer and a bit problematic with getting them in place, but for this one here, that was not the case at all. They went on without any sort of problems. The one modification that I did make to the model, however, was with the addition of the skid rail. One thing that the Airfix kit is missing are the skid rails that are found on top of all the bogie housings, and of course, this is an iconic bit of detailing for the M4 Sherman family. These pieces here were scratch built out of thin strips of soda can aluminum that were simply cut to shape and bent, then eventually fitted to the appropriate locations. However, you'll notice that the shape is a bit different compared to the ones on your standard garden variety Sherman. The Sherman had 3 styles of the skid rails for the VVSS housing. The most common and the most readily seen are what's known as the late production ones. Those are the ones that have that distinctive shape where they come out, they wrap around this way with a nice little bend, then they go straight, bend downward, and then go flat right here where it makes contact with the rear return roller mount. Then there's another version that was developed in the middle or in the mid-war period that was similar but a little bit more blunter than the later version. And then we have the version that we have here, which is the early pattern, which is more symmetrical in shape and basically looks like a British World War I helmet, you know, cut in half. It has that type of a shape to it. So for this build here, I went with the early pattern because for the early nature that this model does represent, this is more than appropriate, and it's also a nice little bit of detailing to add, and it's just something a bit, you know, refreshing compared to just going with the standard type design. The piece, as you can see, it's flat on the front here, it bends upward, and then goes right to the section here where it goes flat and makes contact with the bracket, and on the real one, this is actually how it would get bolted in place. On a similar note with the pieces here, well, first you can see how much detailing it gives the model. It really, you know, fleshes it out, gives it more of a complete look. But also, on top of that, when it comes to painting, this is something that also needs to be, you know, remembered by the builder, and this is something I always reference in these Sherman videos. The return rollers, as well as the rear idler wheel, are not rubber rimmed, so they are basically polished metal on the real units. When the vehicle is driven, any paint on these surfaces here will rub off very, very quickly, and you would see a very shiny, bare, exposed metal surface. And for all of my Sherman builds, I replicate this with a little swipe of silver paint. This was done to both the return rollers, of course, as the rear idler. In addition to that, where it ties into the skid rail tops would be a portion on the vehicle that would get, you know, polished very, very quickly for obviously the same reason. The thing literally just keeps the track from slumping down, so the track is always rubbing up against it. In order to replicate this on a smaller scale model, the same type of silver paint used for the other wheels I just mentioned, a little swipe gets added to the top portion, and the model now is a bit more complete compared to just leaving it, you know, with everything overpainted. Another common question I get on these videos is the model in question pushable? And even though this model does have rotating wheels, the model is not meant to be played with in that regard. The track is single-piece vinyl, of course, is pretty flexible. However, with the scale and with the frailness of these parts here, it's really not something that you're going to be able to just push across your rug and play with it in that manner. This is something that's really best left to be a static model and you just, you know, enjoy it in that format. Going back to the suspension, the pieces are a multi-piece assembly, and even though the model is, you know, 1/76 scale, I still build it in the same manner as I do my larger scale counterparts, where the bogie housings are pre-primed and painted off of the model, and then are assembled and installed at the very tail end. With the weight, or I should say with the scale of all these parts over here, trying to get paint in these sections here is going to be a bit difficult. So that's why I always recommend to pre-paint and pre-prime everything off the model work before you even assemble it prior to final installation. It just really prevents any sort of missed paint areas that will definitely happen if you assemble it and then try to paint it in one go. Believe me, I've built enough of these Shermans in the past as a kid to know, you know, what I'm getting into. In addition to that, the tires are also more easily painted off of the model, and you know, the tires, even though the tooling is as old as it is, you can still thoroughly paint the tires appropriately, and the model will come out absolutely perfect. As for the track, obviously these are the kit supply tracks. They are single-piece vinyl, and I paint them in my usual format with the use of Tamiya acrylics. You never want to use spray paints when you paint single-piece vinyl tracks. It just opens up a window to potential problems, and it's best avoided by using acrylics. I personally roll with Tamiya. XF1 is the base coat for basically all my tracks, and it's been working really good for me so far. The tracks on the model here are representing the early pattern of rubber chevron track, which is a fantastic, you know, pattern for the Sherman tank, but specifically for this early production one here, because this would be more typically seen on the early units. But having said that, you know, these tracks were seen on Shermans all throughout the war. Back to painting. When it comes to painting these tracks, you want to make sure you paint them appropriately. You know, a lot of people out there, they mis-ID the materials of the tracks, and, you know, when they paint and weather it, they tend to over-weather it, or they weather it in a manner that replicates the whole track being steel, and that's just not the case. On the real unit over here, the center portions are a rubber pad, where it's basically rubber over-molded on a steel skeleton, so you're just going to have a thick rubber section on both the inside and the outside. On the end connectors, these are steel, and on the model over here, I painted them with Tamiya Olive Drab, which is a technique I typically reference in these videos. You do have several options for paintwork on the end connectors. They could be Parkerized, they could have an oxide type finish, or you could paint them with a shade of green. You know, that's part of the fun with these Shermans. I personally like going with the Olive Drab method because it gives an extra color pop to the model and gives extra contrast. Otherwise, you're going to have rubber with a different type of black for the end connectors. It does work, and obviously it is acceptable, but to me, visually, it looks better if it's in green. It just, you know, it has more of a contrast to it compared to the other method. But again, your mileage may vary, and there are different options out there for these builds. This one here is just, you know, my personal preference. Moving to the transmission cover, as I mentioned before, this is one of the bigger shortcomings with the kit, where it's an amalgamation of both the early 3-piece transmission cover and the single-piece cast transmission cover, specifically the early pattern. It's almost as if Airfix were using two different tanks to reference and just like combine the two. But regardless, fortunately, this error is something that's easily addressed with some sandpaper, a little bit of red putty, and also about a few minutes of elbow grease. Now that the unit's fully painted and weathered, you get to see the final end result, and it looks absolutely perfect compared to the way the unit started originally. With the unit painted and weathered, you really get to see that cast texturing popping out, and it's just a nice way to enhance the build overall. It's a very easy modification to make, and one that I can't recommend enough if you're working on one of these old school Airfix Shermans. Moving to the rear section, you get to see the other details that I referenced before, but now and again their final form. So starting with the exhaust manifolds, they are painted and weathered. We could see the air filtration boxes over here. Again, these are filled with oil on the real unit, so a little bit of sweaty, oily residue. Weathering was added to those areas because this tends to happen quite a bit if you're trying to service one of these air filters. Yeah, you might get a little sweat or two or a little spillage when you're, you know, trying to dangle this thing with those 4 wing nuts trying to tighten them in place. But regardless, I went ahead and added that slight little bit of weathering to that. You could also see the wings that I referenced earlier. Again, just really fleshes out the back. Not to mention, again, that little squared, or I should say that angled cut area that I also referenced earlier in the video. Overall, all of these additions just really enhance the model and really make it just more polished compared to the original kit condition. Continuing upward, it takes us to the rear dimpy mudguards. These, again, just drop directly in place and just give the model just more extra detailing. And we also have the rear taillights as well as the brush guards. Rear taillights are painted in the usual format. The one on the left-hand side, the cat's eye portion, is painted in red. We have the white light painted below it in a silver strip. Same thing with the opposite side, only the cat's eye is a blackout light, so I painted with a little drop of gloss black. We have the metal brush guards that I fabricated earlier, which again are a huge improvement compared to the kit original. Also on the rear section over here, you get to see the rear lifting lugs that I, again, fabricated. And these are always an easy way to add to your model. If you're working on one of the older tooling kits out there, generally they tend to omit these pieces or have them simplified or molded in. And by simply replacing them replacing them with just bent pieces of wire, it's a great way to just, again, add just a little bit of extra detailing punch to your model. Same, of course, is also true for the ones on the front end. And while back on the front end, you get to see the details here, again, in better light. Here we have the mudguards. Again, a huge, huge bit of detailing that is omitted on the original Airfix kit. And once fitted in place, it just really fleshes it out very, very nicely. With the ECA part, you got the embossed rigidity rib that I mentioned before, as well as the little support bracket, which is something that's generally missed on most kits that are out there, specifically the older ones. But even some newer tooling ones tend to have this piece either omitted or it's done in a slightly different manner. With the piece being single 3D print, it obviously just drops directly in place. And on that note, you can also see the 3 little fasteners right there on the top. And again, everything's just ready for installation straight out of the box. Here you can see the headlights. They, of course, are painted with the appropriate colors. We have the blackout light on top, main lens on the bottom, as well as those fabricated brush guards, which were probably the hardest thing to build on the entire model, but now that's fully painted and weathered, it really was a worthwhile affair. And again, yes, has a little canister that I was touching upon earlier. Nice little bit of detailing to just polish up the tank even more. While on the front, you get to see the direct vision ports, nothing much to mention there, but you also get to see how much more enhanced everything looks with the addition of the well beads that I referenced earlier. These really came out very nice with the addition of the Tamiya panel line accent. Just goes into those areas and just fills in those little gaps and really makes everything pop very nicely. Same is also true for the weld lines on the remainder sections of the model, such as the front area over here, the rear, the top, and even the torch cut lines that would be found on the front corner sections of the armor plate. So moving our way up to the turret, I did have several other things to mention before when the model was being worked on. However, for some reason, those scenes seem to be lost to the sands of time. So regardless, I'll briefly go over this. As I mentioned before, the turret rear bustle section is actually open and it's molded hollow. And this is something that, in my opinion, hurts the look of the build. Now, granted, it's in a location that's not exactly very visible, but it's one of those things that just really bugs me. So on the model over here, you can see some pictures rolling on in of the work that was done to this area. Basically, I just filled in this little cavity with some two-part epoxy. It's the same two-part epoxy I use on my other builds, and it did a fantastic job with, filling in the area, and then once that was dried, it just blended in with the remainder of the cast texturing. For this, you want to avoid using toluene-based putties like red putty or squadron green putty because of the thinness of plastic over there combined with the amount of volume that's used. Perhaps you might be able to get away with it, but in my opinion, I like to err more on the side of caution. And if you are going to use the red putty, this still can be done, same with the green putty, but I would recommend filling in this area with some chunks of scrap polystyrene, like scrap pieces of plastic card or anything along those lines. And that will really occupy that space on the inside so that when you do add the putty, it's a very thin amount on the top, and that should be more than suffice for doing the same procedure. Otherwise, another material I'd recommend would be Milliput or Aves Epoxy Sculpt. Both of those could be added to those areas there without any sort of problems. One other thing to mention about the turret, and we saw this earlier in the video, was that unlike the T-34 where that had a turret lock type system, this one here has just a simple peg where the turret just plugs into the hull, much along the lines as we saw on the Monogram 1/32 scale M48A2. Although unlike that model where there was a peg that got glued to the stem that kept the turret in place and prevented it from popping off, on the Sherman over here, that's not the case. And one thing I wanted to do was to have the turret mounted to the hull in a permanent manner. It just makes for a more, shall we say, proper build. In order to do it on this one, I went ahead and found a scrap spare polycap that was floating around my spare bin from a previous build, and I went ahead and just added that to the location. It was a perfect fit, just plugged on, a little drop of super glue later, and the thing now is firmly set in place. What's great about it is that it obviously keeps the turret onto the hull as intended, but I could also rotate the turret without any sort of issues. Another way to achieve the same effect is to use a soldering gun or a soldering iron. You melt the little tip over there and then you mushroom the end, and that'll essentially do the same thing. However, in my opinion, the polycap is a much better idea because it just makes the turret, or when you rotate the turret, it just feels just higher quality with this way as opposed to the melted way. Melted way will work, it just adds a little bit extra play in it, but again, if you don't have anything on hand, the soldering iron trick will definitely get you the same end result. One last thing I want to mention about the turret is with the surrounding areas. So before the model, or I should say before the turret was fixed in place, I went ahead and took a paintbrush and with some Tamiya flat black, I paintbrushed it on the turret neck section on the hull and also on the under recesses of the turret. This was done because, again, once the turret is fitted in place, you're not exactly going to be able to get in there very easily with the primer and the paint, and to avoid any sort of missed paint locations, it's best done at that point. Once the paint was dry, the turret was then secured in place, like I mentioned before, and everything was good to go. Once the model went off into its later coats of prime and paint, everything was able to be painted thoroughly over, leaving for the end result that you see here. And if I go ahead and hopefully get this on screen, you can see that the bottom bustle section is filled in as it would be on a standard Sherman tank. Also, on the top sections, you can see that, again, everything has been thoroughly painted and primed. And the paint does, of course, stick best to the areas that have been pre-primed. So continuing with the turret details, I already mentioned the lift rings previously, so nothing much to go over there. But here you get to see the cast texturing now in its final format. For the cast texturing this, I went with the super glue method as opposed to the red putty method that I've shown on several videos already that are found on the channel. The procedure is applied in the exact same way, it's just a medium that's slightly different. I like to utilize super glue on smaller builds like this here because I always found that the super glue gives me a little more precision compared to the red putty, specifically when you're trying to work around molding details like the periscopes and the blower like you see presently. When I was doing the procedure, of course, the mantlet and the hatches were not fitted in place. This is, best done after the procedure has already been concluded. Some other things to mention about the turret is the drilling out here of the pintle mount. This was solid, simple pin vise, small bit was able to take care of the rest. And also we have here the painting of the antenna base. This is a stock antenna base and I painted it to replicate an MP37, which if anyone has seen one of those antenna bases, they have this really wide insulator that's found on the bottom, and for the paintwork this is done in my usual format. The insulator is painted with Tamiya Hull Red, a little swipe of gloss was added to get that nice ceramic sheen, and then the remaining sections were just painted with a drop of, or a different color of olive drab for extra contrast. This one here I left it with the antenna off because trying to drill this out and have the antenna present with pieces this small was a bit problematic, so I just simply omitted for this build. Of course the antennas can be removed and plugged on and off on the real one, so you're not exactly losing out on anything. Carry on to the remainder of the armament. Here we have the 75, stock out of the box. Perhaps just a little sanding was done just to get rid of any sort of mold line that was present on the tooling. The unit can go up and down. One thing that's interesting is that this is purely a friction fit, but one thing that's nice is that it is on so well that you could just hold the whole tank up from the 75 and it doesn't fall apart. But if I try to pull it out, you can see it will just simply slide out. The piece is nicely designed in that regard, so in the fact that the friction fit is so good that you're not going to have to worry about barrel droop or anything like that, so there's really no point in customizing or modifying the elevation on this model. Basically just build out of the box and you should be good to go. So the kit is actually pretty well engineered in that respect. And that's all there really is to the detailing of the build. This brings us now to the paint and the marking. So for the model's paintwork, I went with an early shade of olive drab. This is the same color that I've used on a few other early pattern World War II builds that are found on the channel, most notably the 1/6 scale M3 Lee and my 1/6 scale M4A4 Sherman. The shades darkened and differed quite a bit during World War II, but in the very early portion, they kind of had a shade similar to this, so that's why I went with this shade here, because for this type of vehicle, being an early M4 with these markings, no less, it was actually a perfect pair. The paint is exterior latex. This was applied via the airbrush. Of course, the model needs to be thoroughly primed before the paint is applied. The primer is just El Cheapo flat black spray paint, as I mentioned in a few other videos, and then the paint was just simply diluted and then airbrush applied. After the paint fully set, I went with the weathering, and the weathering is done with both airbrush as well as dry brushing. The airbrushing was used for the counter shading, for the wash that the vehicle does have, and then the dry brushing was used for the little, worn edge and chipping effects that are generally seen on my builds. After the tank was weathered, the markings were applied, and these are the kit supply decals. The kit does supply you with decals to render this vehicle either as US Army or as British Army. Obviously, I went with the US. The one thing to mention, though, is that on the instruction sheet, they do have a bumper ID number that goes right over here, which it would on the real vehicle. However, the kit supply decal has a T prefix, which is something that you see on British Shermans and not US vehicles. US vehicles would have a TO&E marking that would have a USA prefix, or if it's a very early war vehicle, or even a pre-war vehicle, you would have a W prefix in most cases, neither of which were supplied on this vehicle here, so I simply omitted it on this example. However, the other decals were applied, such as the little Armor Division logo right there, which admittedly is not necessarily correct, but it's not out of the realm of reality. Specifically, this vehicle here, this is more or less the type of tank you would see at the U.S. training center, so having the patch over there is not necessarily inaccurate, but it's definitely far from being a dead ringer. Regardless, I threw it on the model because well, why not? The other thing to mention, though, is with the markings for the turret. Of course, this was something that was kit supplied, and I was definitely going to utilize on this build. These markings are more than appropriate for this pattern of Sherman. So the white stripe with the stars on the turret was something that was seen on very early war U.S. military vehicles. Such examples come to mind would not just be the M4, but the M4A1, M3 Lee, and also the M3 Stewart. There were also a few different color combinations. We had this one here, which is all white, but there was also a yellow pattern as well. These were mostly used stateside at Fort Knox or the Desert Training Center. However, there were examples of these vehicles with markings like this that saw service in North Africa in both white and yellow. There is some debate about that, but there are photographic proof of yellow striped and starred vehicles in North Africa. Regardless, for this one here, I utilized the kit decals. The kit decals were pretty good. However, the kit decals are incomplete. They give you the decals to mount onto the sides of the vehicle. However, the rear bustle section does not have any connection stripe that bridges the two. So on the model over here, in order to complete it, I simply took some white in a very thin paintbrush, and I basically just connected the two lines together. All of the Shermans that had the white stripe around the turret would have had the stripe running continuously across in a band like you see here. So if you are going to render the model in this format, you have to have that little stripe in the back, or else it's just going to not look right. So as I mentioned several times in this video, this is not the first time that I built an Airfix Sherman tank. The first time this was done when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and that model, as I mentioned several times, is still in existence. In fact, I'll go ahead and bring it onto the table. But before I do, bear in mind the model's not exactly in the best condition, and it's something that has definitely been played with quite a bit, so it's seen better days, shall we say. But, so with that in mind, here we have the very first tank model that I ever built. So drum roll, please. And there she is. Sadly, and also ironically, the barrel is broken off, and that's something that actually happened recently because the thing actually survived all these years and all the times I played with it with the barrel intact, but, you know, it's probably in a box somewhere. I got to dig it up. Regardless, here is the model. So as I mentioned before, this is the one that came with the landing craft set, and it's basically been in this condition now going on almost 30 years. The model, as I mentioned before, was built by myself with help from my father, and as I also mentioned before, he had trouble with the tracks getting them fitted in place, so he used some nylon string just to prevent it from flying off, and he tried to sculpt the missing area here with some Tester's white putty. It was a novel attempt, but let's just say there are better ways to do that now. The tracks, as you can see, are a bit more stiffer compared to the ones on the newer kit, as I already mentioned briefly. The sprocket has been repaired more than one occasion, and it definitely shows it. And yeah, the thing has been, I think, repainted 2 or 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. Like, there's the original paint right there, which appears to be Model Master Olive Drab. And it looks like, yeah, it got some sort of a touch-up at some point, but the decals are original, and they were not dull-coated or anything. These are just the original decals, and surprisingly held up very well this entire time. This one here does have the T prefix on it. This is the same decal that, by the way, supplied with the other one, only this one here is a British Sherman. I wasn't told that at the time when it was built. I preferred it to be American, but regardless, these are the decals that come with that set. At some point in time, I wouldn't mind giving this one a nice little facelift, although I wouldn't, for sentimental values, give it as much of a complete teardown rebuild as the other OTRs, but, perhaps I'll give this one a nice little polish up. But, that's potentially something for a video down the road. But here we go. The original and the new version. And at the end of the day, I couldn't be any happier in how this build turned out. This was a very fun little build indeed. It definitely had some surprises to it because honestly, when I first took this project on, I wasn't expecting to do the modifications and upgrades that I made to it in order to bring it up to the condition that we have here. Having said all that, going through the upgrade process definitely is something I do not regret. And in the end, it's going to be an excellent, really cool little addition to have to my collection. And this slides us directly into, you guessed it, skill level and recommendation. So unlike many of the other builds that I bring on this channel where I say, this is a great model, but it's really more or less intended for someone that has a intermediate to advanced range. It's not really something geared for a beginner. This model here, it's actually not the case. As someone, I can personally attest to this, a 7-year-old was able to put this together, albeit with some help from his father. But regardless, the model was still something that I was able to assemble even back then, literally coming straight out of the gate. And if a 7-year-old can tackle one of these, I'm pretty sure so could most people with a pulse. The Caveat, though, is that you want to be very careful with some of the finer molded components, namely the parts on the suspension, the sprocket, things like that. Outside of those sub-assemblies, the rest of the model really does go together fairly easily. Needless to say, if a beginner can tackle one of these models, this should be absolutely no problems with anyone who has an intermediate to an advanced range, and chances are pretty good if you've already achieved that type of skill set, you've already probably built one of these models in the past, and if you haven't, you might want to jump on one. I mean, it's low-hanging fruit. Even though it's low-hanging fruit, it's still delicious fruit nonetheless. As primitive as this kit is, it still polishes up into a model that can punch well above its own weight. Now, a few other people out there are probably not going to be interested in this build, specifically the type of people that are looking for more of a higher-end product. Specifically, if you are a rivet counting perfectionist, this kit here is probably not going to be to your liking. If that's the case, you may want to steer more towards one of the more modern super kits, specifically the lineup from Dragon. I know, some elitists out there is going to poo-poo that, but Dragon does have a line of 1/72 scale Shermans that are actually really, really good. I built one of their M4A1s in the past. Wouldn't mind building another one, maybe throw it on the channel one of these days. But regardless, if you're looking for something that has just the next level of detailing, then you might want to check out one of those kits. However, you don't want to necessarily discount the Airfix Sherman. It is an excellent model. They basically got the dimensions right on it, and with just a little bit of extra elbow grease, you could really polish it up into something very nice. Shifting gears brings us to recommendations, and along similar lines, if you are someone who is an absolute Sherman fan, you just love the M4 Sherman, much as yours truly here, you would be a fool not to have one of these in your collection. These kits are awesome, they're really fun to build, they're really affordable, they're really easy to track down, and they're just a really unique version of the M4 Sherman. The one person who I would not necessarily recommend this to is if you are a rivet counting snob, but then again, you are basically unappeasable, so there's no point really going over to that. But basically, like what I mentioned before, if you're looking for something that has more accurate detail fidelity, you may want to steer more towards one of the more modern kits, as opposed to this one over here. Having said that, if you're okay with what this kit brings to the table, it is a fantastic model to add to your collection. It's one that, again, very easily obtained, very affordably obtained, and it's honestly a blast building. It's a nice, quick little build, and it's a fun one at that. All those little ingredients over there really make for a very, very appetizing sauce. Aside from the Sherman fan, I would recommend this kit for anyone who's just an avid fan of American armor, American World War II armor, just World War II armor in general. Also, if you are an avid Braille scale fan, you'll be foolish not to at least have one of these in your collection. And if you're also into dioramas, this kit again is awesome for that because of its small scale and its affordability and availability. You could really have some interesting scenes concocted with using one of these kits here or multiples of these kits here. Regardless, I'll leave that to the diorama experts out there, but all things considered, it's a fantastic kit and it does have a lot of potential to it, which is probably why it's been sticking around for as long as it has been. The final person I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's an avid fan of building and collecting vintage plastic model kits. Unlike many of the other vintage kits that I brought on the table before, where they're really cool, but those haven't been in production for a great period of time and are collectible, and because of that, the prices tend to be elevated on those. This one here, that's not the case. This thing here is basically like the horseshoe crab, and just like that marvelous creature, it's still with us today. And because of that, this thing is, again, low-hanging fruit, but because of that, that doesn't necessarily take away from how awesome it really is. This model here, it's a great way to enter into the vintage plastic kit collecting and do so in a way that's not going to break the bank, and you're not going to have, that little thought in the back of your head about, oh no, should I build this one? It's valuable and none of that stuff. This is a carefree build. You can build it to your heart's content and have absolutely no worries about value or anything along those lines. Which at the end of the day, these models are meant to be built, and by indulging and enjoying yourself, it's the best way to appreciate one of these older models. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/76 scale US early production M4 Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being smaller scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on the channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.